The hallway backstage was loud, but the moment they said it, everything felt quiet. Not because the music stopped, not because the crowd outside wasn't screaming, but because every person within earshot knew something had just gone wrong. The opening band stood near the dressing rooms, laughing a little too confidently, talking a little too loudly. The kind of laughter that wasn't funny, just sharp enough to cut. One of them leaned back against a road case, smirked, and said it. A sentence meant to humiliate, a sentence meant to impress the wrong people. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was casual. And that's what made it worse. A few crew members froze mid-step. A tour assistant glanced down the hallway, suddenly wishing they were somewhere else. Someone whispered, "Don't say that," but it was already too late, because the man they were talking about had heard everything. He didn't react at first. No raised voice, no argument, no sudden movement. He just stopped walking. The laughter behind him kept going for exactly 2 seconds. Then it faded, not because anyone told them to stop, but because they noticed he'd turned around. This wasn't the version of him they expected. Not the wild image they'd mocked, not the broken caricature they thought was left behind by time. This was something quieter. He looked tired, yes, but not weak. Calm, but not soft. And in that moment, something heavy settled in the hallway. The band didn't apologize. They didn't backtrack. They didn't even realize the danger yet. They thought they'd won. They thought silence meant nothing. What they didn't understand was this. In this industry, silence from the wrong person is louder than any scream. Because when legends speak, they don't need speeches. They don't need threats. They don't need explanations. Sometimes all it takes is 4 words. And by the time those words were spoken, an entire career had already ended. This wasn't some small club with sticky floors and broken speakers. It was a full-scale tour stop. One of those nights where everything had to run on precision. Tractor trailers lined the loading dock like steel giants. Crew members moved with headsets and clipboards, timing every step down to the minute. Outside, thousands of fans pressed against barricades, chanting a name they'd waited decades to hear. Inside the venue, the air was thick with electricity and exhaustion. Backstage was a maze of narrow hallways, tangled cables, half-open dressing room doors, and the low hum of generators bleeding through the walls. You could smell coffee, sweat, and fresh paint from temporary set pieces. This was the calm before the storm, the final breath before the lights went down. Ozzy was already there, not making noise, not demanding attention. He sat slightly apart from the chaos, dressed simply, conserving energy. His movements were slower than they used to be, but deliberate. Every step had purpose. This was a man who had learned, sometimes the hard way, that survival in this business meant choosing when to speak and when not to. A few feet away, the opening band occupied a very different space. They were loud, loose, buzzing with adrenaline. Their gear was stacked proudly, their laughter echoing off concrete walls. They'd been bragging about the crowd size, the exposure, the moment they were about to have. For them, tonight wasn't about respect, it was about being noticed. And somewhere along the way, confidence curdled into arrogance. They hadn't earned the hallway yet. They hadn't earned the silence. To them, Ozzy wasn't a legend standing 10 feet away. He was a name on a poster, a headline they'd grown up hearing. A story from another era. And like too many before them, they mistook familiarity for equality. No one officially introduced them, no one warned them. But backstage etiquette is an unspoken language, and they were ignoring every rule. Crew members exchanged looks. A stage manager shifted uncomfortably. Someone muttered under their breath, hoping the night would pass without incident. Because everyone else understood what the opening band didn't. Backstage isn't neutral ground, it's sacred. Every word travels. Every tone is remembered, and when respect disappears in a place like this, consequences don't arrive loudly. They arrive quietly. By this point in his life, Ozzy Osbourne didn't need to prove anything to anyone. That was the mistake people kept making. They saw the slower walk. They heard the softer voice. They noticed the way he conserved his energy instead of burning it. And they assumed the fire was gone. What they didn't see was everything that fire had already survived. This was a man who had been written off more times than most artists ever get written about. The industry tried to bury him in the 70s. The tabloids tried to destroy him in the 80s. Addiction, scandal, cancellations, every decade came with a new reason why Ozzy shouldn't still be here. And yet he was, still touring, still drawing crowds that spanned generations, still commanding rooms without raising his voice. Ozzy had outlived trends, critics, and entire genres of music. Bands that once mocked him had disappeared into nostalgia playlists. Executives who doubted him were long gone. Even the controversies that once defined him had faded, replaced by something far more dangerous in this business: legacy. Because legacy doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. Legacy waits. At this stage, Ozzy wasn't competing anymore. He wasn't chasing relevance or fighting for attention. He had moved into a rarefied space. One where influence lived behind the scenes. Where a single decision could quietly change the direction of someone else's career. He understood how tours worked, how booking agents talked, how promoters shared notes. He knew that reputations didn't spread through headlines, but through phone calls, through short conversations that ended with, "Yeah, maybe not them." And Ozzy also understood something else the opening band didn't. Respect had replaced rage. Younger Ozzy might have exploded, might have laughed it off, might have turned the moment into chaos. But time had stripped him down to essentials. What remained was clarity. He didn't argue with disrespect anymore. He didn't correct it. He didn't fear it. He simply decided who got access and who didn't. That's the power that comes when you've already lost everything once and lived. Because when you survive that kind of fire, you stop reacting emotionally. You stop explaining yourself. You stop wasting energy on people who don't matter in the long run. You become selective. And in an industry where access is everything, where being in the right room can change your life, that selectivity becomes a weapon. The opening band saw an aging rock star. What they were actually standing near was a closed door they hadn't even realized they needed to stay open. And in just a few moments, that door was about to shut. It didn't happen in a dramatic way. There was no shouting match, no finger pointing, no sudden confrontation that drew a crowd. That's what made it dangerous. The opening band was clustered near their gear, half-dressed for the set, riding the nervous energy that comes right before you step on stage. Someone cracked a joke about the crowd. Another one laughed too hard. Then one of them, trying to be clever, trying to impress, let the comment slip. It was aimed sideways, not directly at him. Not loudly enough to be official, just enough to be heard. They joked about his relevance, about how this tour must be running on nostalgia. Someone added that they couldn't believe this was the guy they were supposed to open for. Another voice chimed in, mocking the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way time had caught up with him. It was casual cruelty, the kind that hides behind sarcasm and calls itself honesty. A couple of people laughed. Not everyone. One crew member stiffened instantly. Another looked down at their phone, pretending not to hear. A tour assistant took a step back. Like distance alone might undo what had just been said. Because everyone who'd been around long enough recognized the sound. This wasn't banter. This wasn't humor. This was disrespect. And then came the line, the one that crossed the invisible boundary. The sentence that turned joking into something irreversible. It landed with a smirk, followed by a laugh that lingered just a little too long. That's when Ozzy stopped walking. He didn't turn immediately. He didn't react the way they expected. He paused. Long enough for the sound of the generators to feel louder. Long enough for the hallway to tighten. Long enough for the opening band's laughter to thin out as awareness began to creep in. Someone whispered, "Hey, chill." Too late. Ozzy turned around slowly. Not angry. Not rushed. Just enough to face them. For the first time, they actually looked at him, not the myth, not the image, not the headline. The real man standing 10 feet away. Quiet. Unamused. And suddenly, the joke didn't feel funny anymore. No one spoke. No apology came. No explanation followed. The opening band waited for a reaction they could fight, a comment they could deflect, a moment they could spin later into a story. But Ozzy didn't give them any of that. He simply looked at them, long enough for the weight of their words to land where it couldn't be laughed off. That's when the room understood something important. They hadn't just insulted a person, they'd insulted a system built on respect, memory, and influence. And Ozzy hadn't said a single word yet, but the damage, that part was already done. The hallway didn't explode. It didn't erupt into shouting or chaos or security stepping in. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public humiliation, no moment that anyone could later rewrite as just a misunderstanding. Instead, there was silence. Not the empty kind, but the heavy kind. The kind that presses down on your chest and makes you aware of every sound you'd been ignoring seconds before. The hum of the generators. The faint echo of the crowd outside. The squeak of a road case being rolled somewhere far down the corridor. Ozzy stood there without moving. The opening band waited. At first, they thought this was it, that he hadn't heard them clearly, or that he'd decided they weren't worth the effort. One of them shifted their weight, forcing a laugh that died halfway out of their throat. Another checked the time on their phone, suddenly very interested in anything but the man in front of them. They were used to reactions. They were used to pushback, to arguments, to someone snapping back so the moment could turn into a story they controlled. That's how confrontations usually worked for them. Noise, emotion, something they could frame as rock and roll chaos. But this was different. Ozzy didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself. He didn't even change his expression. And that unsettled them more than anger ever could. Crew members began to drift closer, not openly, not obviously. Just enough to sense that something important was unfolding. A stage manager slowed their walk. A guitar tech stopped pretending to tune strings. Everyone felt it. This was a moment you didn't interrupt. Because legends don't react the way normal people do. They calculate. Ozzy's silence wasn't confusion. It wasn't hesitation. It was a decision forming. You could almost see it, the line being drawn, the door quietly closing in his mind. Years of experience distilled into a single choice. Is this worth my energy? The opening band still hadn't apologized. That was the second mistake. They mistook the pause for mercy, for indecision, for a chance to let the moment fade if they just stood still long enough. One of them smirked, faintly, like the tension itself was amusing. That smirk didn't go unnoticed. Around them, people who understood the industry exchanged looks. This wasn't going to end loudly, but it was going to end permanently, because backstage power doesn't announce itself. It moves through glances, through silence, through who gets invited back and who doesn't. Ozzy finally took a breath. Slow. Measured. The kind of breath you take when you already know what you're about to say, and you don't need to raise your voice to make it count. The hallway felt smaller now. The opening band stood a little straighter. Their confidence was gone, replaced by something new and unfamiliar, uncertainty. They were waiting for anger. They were waiting for a lecture. They were waiting for anything they could push against. What they didn't realize was this. When someone like Ozzy goes quiet, the decision has already been made, and whatever came next wasn't going to be emotional. It was going to be final. Ozzy didn't step forward. He didn't lean in. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there exactly where he was, as if the hallway itself had decided to hold its breath with him. For a moment, it felt like he might say nothing at all, like he might turn back around and walk away, leaving the opening band suspended in their own awkwardness. And for a split second, they hoped that's what would happen. That silence would be the end of it. That hope didn't last. Ozzy looked at them, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with something colder. Recognition. The kind that comes when you've seen this exact moment play out 100 times before, just with different faces. He'd seen arrogance before. He'd seen disrespect before. He'd seen people confuse proximity to greatness with permission. This wasn't new. What was new for them was standing on the other side of it. Ozzy tilted his head slightly, like he was lining up a thought that had already finished forming. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud enough to carry down the hallway. It didn't need to. It was calm, clear, unemotional, 4 words, that's all. No insults, no threats, no explanation. Just 4 words spoken evenly, as if he were stating the weather. You'll never open for meet again. Each word landed separately, not rushed, not softened. The space between them felt intentional, like he wanted each one to sink in before the next arrived. By the time he finished, the sentence didn't echo. It didn't need to. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The opening band stared at him, processing what they'd just heard. One of them opened their mouth, then closed it again. Another laughed, once out of pure reflex, before realizing no one else was laughing, because everyone else understood immediately. This wasn't drama. This wasn't posturing. This was a decision. In this business, opening for someone like Ozzy wasn't just a gig. It was access, exposure, credibility, a quiet stamp of approval that followed you long after the tour ended. It was the difference between being remembered and being replaced, and with 4 words that access was gone, no appeals process, no second chances. No, let's talk about it later. Ozzy didn't wait for a response. He didn't stand around to watch the realization hit. He turned back around and walked away at the same pace he'd been moving before, as if the conversation had already ended the moment it began. Behind him, the hallway stayed frozen. A manager rushed forward, voice low and urgent. A tour rep's face drained of color. Someone muttered, "Oh no," under their breath, like they'd just watched a slow-motion crash they couldn't stop. The opening band finally understood what had happened. They hadn't been yelled at. They hadn't been embarrassed publicly. They hadn't been given a villain to fight. They'd been quietly erased. Because when someone at Ozzy's level says something that calm, that final, it doesn't stay between the people in the hallway. It travels. It gets repeated. It gets remembered. And the scariest part, he hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't insulted them back. He hadn't needed to. 4 words had done what shouting never could. They didn't just end a conversation. They closed a door, one the opening band wouldn't even realize they needed, until it was far too late. The moment Ozzy disappeared down the hallway, reality rushed in to fill the space he left behind. It hit fast. The opening band didn't move at first. They stood there like they were waiting for someone to yell cut. Like the scene might reset if they just stayed still long enough. One of them finally exhaled, slow and shaky, as if holding their breath might somehow rewind the last 30 seconds. It didn't. A manager stepped forward immediately, too quickly, too urgently. His voice dropped into that quiet, controlled tone reserved for emergencies that aren't supposed to be public. "What did you say?" he asked. No one answered right away. Another laugh slipped out short, nervous and completely wrong for the moment. It earned a look so sharp it shut everything down instantly. Phones came out. Messages were typed and erased. Someone glanced toward the dressing rooms, half expecting Ozzy to come back and clarify. He didn't. That's when the weight of it landed. Crew members who'd been pretending not to listen suddenly had places to be. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A stagehand rolled a case past them without making eye contact. A tour assistant whispered something into a headset and walked away quickly. The hallway had already moved on. Because backstage, moments like this don't linger, they calcify. The opening band's confidence evaporated. Shoulders tightened, jokes vanished. They weren't thinking about their set anymore. They were thinking about damage control, about who had heard, who would repeat it, how fast the story would spread. And it would spread. In this industry, nothing stays isolated. Especially not something involving Ozzy Osbourne. A tour rep approached, polite but firm. "We'll talk after the set," they said, not angry, not comforting, neutral, and somehow that was worse. Neutral meant decisions were already being made. One of the band members tried to explain, said it was taken out of context, said it was just messing around. The words sounded hollow even to them. Nobody interrupted, but nobody nodded either. No one was convinced, because context doesn't erase disrespect. And apologies delivered after consequences aren't really apologies, they're negotiations. As showtime approached, the opening band went onstage like scheduled. The crowd cheered. But something was different. They felt it immediately, the disconnect, the missing energy. The performance was fine technically. The songs were tight. But the spark was gone. Their heads weren't in it. Backstage, no one watched. No reps, no managers, no curious eyes. When they came offstage sweating and breathless, there was no congratulations waiting, no nods, no casual praise. Just instructions, short, efficient. Cold, pack up quickly, clear the hallway, we'll be in touch. That last line echoed louder than any insult, because "we'll be in touch" didn't mean a call was coming, it meant the opposite. As the main show began and the venue erupted, the opening band stood near the edge of the backstage area, suddenly invisible. The same hallway that had felt like opportunity an hour earlier now felt like exile. They hadn't been screamed at. They hadn't been thrown out. They'd been downgraded to an afterthought. And that's when they realized the truth. Ozzy's 4 words hadn't just ended a moment. They'd shifted the entire trajectory of their night, and possibly their career. And the scariest part, the night wasn't even over yet. The real damage didn't happen that night. That was the part no one warned them about. The opening band still finished the show. Their gear still made it back into cases. Their van still pulled away from the venue like it always did. On the surface, nothing looked broken. But beneath that surface, everything had shifted. By the next morning, the tour schedule had changed. No announcement, no explanation. Just a quiet update passed between managers and promoters. A few dates adjusted. A few logistical decisions made. The opening band was still listed for now, but the language around them had changed. Less enthusiasm, more distance. Behind the scenes, conversations were already happening. A booking agent made a call. A tour manager sent a short message. A promoter asked a careful question, not what happened, but is this someone we should avoid? That's how reputations change in this business. Not through headlines, but through hesitation. The opening band noticed it almost immediately. Emails took longer to get answered. Replies that once came with excitement arrived late, if they came at all. Opportunities that felt locked in suddenly needed to be reconsidered. No one accused them outright. No one explained, but everyone knew. Because Ozzy didn't need to blacklist anyone. He didn't need to complain or demand loyalty. His name alone carried weight, and when someone at that level quietly withdrew support, people paid attention. Promoters didn't want problems. Agents didn't want tension. Tours didn't want egos that disrupted harmony. And disrespect, especially public or backstage disrespect, was the one thing no one wanted attached to their event. Within weeks, the pattern was undeniable. A festival slot fell through. A support offer never materialized. A label meeting got postponed indefinitely. The opening band started hearing phrases they'd never heard before. We're going in a different direction. It's not the right fit. Maybe next cycle. Each sentence sounded polite. Each one meant the same thing. Doors were closing. And the hardest part, they couldn't point to a single moment and say, this is where it went wrong. Because the industry doesn't punish you loudly. It simply stops making room for you. Meanwhile, Ozzy kept touring. Night after night, he walked onto stages filled with thousands of people who sang every word back to him. New opening acts rotated in, bands who understood the unspoken rules, bands who treated the hallway with respect, bands who knew when to talk and when to stay quiet. No speeches were given, no lessons announced, but the message traveled anyway. People talk, crew members move between tours, stories get told in fragments. Don't mess around backstage. Respect the room. Remember what happened to that band? The opening band never heard their own story directly. They just felt its shadow follow them. And that's when the truth finally set in. It wasn't the insult that ended things. It was the arrogance behind it. Because talent can open doors, but attitude decides how long they stay open. Ozzy's 4 words weren't cruel. They weren't dramatic. They were corrective. A boundary drawn by someone who'd earned the right to draw it. Years later, the band would still talk about that night, not publicly, not in interviews quietly, among themselves. As the moment everything changed, and the irony, if Ozzy had yelled, it might have become a story. If he'd argued, it might have become publicity. But he didn't. He simply stepped back. And in an industry built on access, stepping back was all it took to make everything fall apart. And it wasn't the words themselves that made the impact. It wasn't the tone, or even the context of the insult. It was what they represented. When Ozzy Osbourne spoke those 4 words, calm, measured, precise, they carried more weight than any scream or rant ever could. Because by that point in his life, he had earned something that few ever truly understand: unquestioned authority. In the music industry, respect is currency. Not money, not fame, not flashy performances. Respect, it's invisible, but it moves through rooms faster than any press release. It dictates who gets the stage, whose calls are returned, whose ideas are taken seriously. And it doesn't need to be loud. Ozzy had lived long enough to see how it worked. He knew that careers could rise or fall in a single hallway. He understood that opportunity isn't just about talent. It's about timing, demeanor, and above all, how you treat the people around you. One misstep, one moment of arrogance, and doors that seemed open forever could close quietly, without fanfare. The opening band had made that mistake. They mistook casual disrespect for harmless fun. They believed that challenging a legend backstage, in a private moment, wouldn't matter. They were wrong, because Ozzy's words were not just a response, they were a judgment. A silent verdict delivered with authority. You'll never open for me again. 4 words delivered without emotion, without shouting, without drama. No one else needed to speak. No manager, no promoter, no label needed to intervene. Everyone in the room immediately understood the consequences. It was a masterclass in control. It was a reminder that power doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it whispers in a calm, deliberate tone. Sometimes it waits patiently while arrogance speaks first, then quietly closes the door on opportunity. And the fallout wasn't immediate. That's the subtle genius of it. The opening band finished their set. They packed up, they left the venue, but the effect lingered. Opportunities evaporated. Meetings got delayed indefinitely. Offers that once seemed guaranteed disappeared. The story spread quietly among the people who made decisions, the promoters, the booking agents, the tour managers. Ozzy didn't need to fight. He didn't need to lecture. He didn't even need to publicize it. His words were enough. 4 simple words had recalibrated an entire career trajectory. That's why they were powerful. Because in a world obsessed with attention, these 4 words reminded everyone that silence carries authority. That respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. That influence, when wielded correctly, doesn't need theatrics to leave its mark. And most importantly, it was a lesson about timing and legacy. Ozzy could have shouted. He could have lashed out. He could have humiliated the band publicly, but he didn't. By waiting, by observing, by speaking calmly, he ensured the lesson would be remembered far longer than any emotional outburst could have lasted. In the end, it wasn't just about shutting down a band. It was about showing the world and reminding himself that experience, patience, and measured authority always win over arrogance. And that's the true power of 4 words. Backstage, the hallway returned to its usual rhythm. The hum of equipment, the soft shuffling of crew members, the low murmur of performers prepping for the next show. All of it went on as if nothing had happened. But for those who had witnessed it, nothing would ever be the same. The opening band had walked away with the immediate sting of embarrassment, but what really lingered was the invisible lesson they hadn't even realized they were learning. It wasn't just that a career could be affected by a few words. It was that respect, timing, and awareness matter more than talent or bravado. That opportunity, once lost, rarely comes back. That in a world full of loud voices, calm authority carries far more weight than anyone expects. Ozzy Osbourne stepped onto the stage later that night, greeted by thousands of fans who cheered not just for the music, but for the legacy he had built. He didn't need to mention what had just happened backstage. He didn't need to boast. He didn't need to explain. The crowd, the energy, and the history they shared said it all. And that's the essence of the story. It's not about revenge. It's not about humiliation. It's about understanding the power of restraint, about knowing that true influence is quiet, deliberate, and measured. It's about surviving adversity, learning from experience, and recognizing when action, or even silence, can carry far more weight than any public display of anger. Legends like Ozzy don't need to shout to be remembered. They don't need to lecture to be feared or respected. They have seen the highs and lows of their own lives, endured failures, and outlasted critics. They understand what words, delivered at the right moment, can do, and they use that understanding wisely. For the opening band, the lesson was harsh but permanent. Opportunities vanished. Conversations stopped. Doors closed quietly, irrevocably. And while they continued to play music, the trajectory of their careers had already been altered, simply because they failed to recognize the unspoken rules of respect and timing. And for everyone watching this story, the lesson is universal. Never underestimate someone who has survived fire. Never assume that calm means weakness. Never confuse opportunity with entitlement, because those who have proven themselves in ways most people cannot imagine, through years of struggle, loss, and endurance, don't need to defend themselves. They don't need to shout. They don't need to threaten. When they act even in 4 simple words, the world listens. Ozzy Osbourne didn't just end a conversation. He ended a moment, a trajectory, a lesson that would ripple through the industry quietly but forever. And the reason it worked wasn't because he wanted to punish anyone. It was because he knew the value of experience, the weight of authority, and the power of precise words. So the final message is simple, but unforgettable. Respect isn't given, it's earned. Influence isn't loud, it's measured. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say, or choose not to say, is exactly what needs to be heard. Because in the end, it's not the chaos that defines you. It's how you handle it. And that's the legacy of the 4 words.